The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a true behemoth of World War II aviation. It earned the affectionate, yet often critical, nickname, the Jug, due to its barrel-like fuselage. Early on, its sheer size and formidable weight led many to question its maneuverability in a dogfight. American and Allied pilots quickly learned that the P-47 was a champion of high-altitude speed and devastating dives. Its powerful Pratt and Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine delivered over 2,000 horsepower to a massive four-bladed propeller. This engine provided the brute force necessary to haul its nearly 10-ton frame into the fray and sustain incredible punishment. The aircraft could absorb cannon fire that would instantly shatter the lighter construction of a Messerschmitt or a Spitfire. Armed with an intimidating battery of 8.50 caliber machine guns, the Thunderbolt was a flying tank that delivered unparalleled destructive power. Its primary role in the European theater was initially high-altitude escort, but it excelled as a low-level ground attack fighter. The initial versions, like the P-47D, possessed excellent short to medium range capabilities over the relatively compact European battle space. However, its internal fuel capacity still limited its deep penetrations into German territory from the British airfields. This restriction was a technical hurdle that the Allied planners were constantly striving to overcome throughout the war. The P-47 established itself as a reliable, tough, and potent fighter, but a reputation for being heavy and less graceful than its counterparts persisted among some critics. This powerful machine was a testament to American industrial might and the strategy of prioritizing ruggedness over feather-light agility in design. The aircraft's unique ability to sustain catastrophic damage and still bring its pilot home became the stuff of legend across the 8th Air Force. It was a fortress in the sky, beloved by the bomber crews it protected and feared by the enemy pilots who faced its enormous firepower. Despite its successful service, the perception of the P-47 as a massive, heavy fighter would later fuel a great deal of underestimation from its adversaries. The need for greater range was the single most pressing development challenge that Republic aviation had to address for the war's final, vast theater of operations.
The pilots of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy Air Services were initially focused on the P-38 Lightning and the F-U Corsair. When the P-47 began appearing in the Pacific, it was met with a degree of dismissive contempt, especially by veteran Japanese pilots. Japanese doctrine highly favored lightweight, highly agile interceptors like the Mitsubishi A6M0, prioritizing maneuverability above all else. The Zero could turn on a dime and outclimb virtually any Allied fighter at lower altitudes during the early stages of the war. To the Japanese, the sheer bulk of the P-47 seemed like a design flaw, a slow, lumbering target ripe for exploitation in a turning fight. They derisively nicknamed the P-47 the Fatso or the Iron Pigs due to its wide, deep fuselage and heavily armored construction. This mockery stemmed from a fundamental difference in fighter philosophy. Japanese pilots saw American weight as a symbol of poor design and sluggish performance. They confidently believed their lighter, nimble aircraft would easily dance around the seemingly clumsy American fighter in a close-quarters engagement. However, this early hubris failed to account for the P-47's incredible high-speed dive performance and its robust engine. Japanese pilots learned, often fatally, that engaging the Thunderbolt in a dive or a high-speed pass was suicidal. The P-47's superior high-altitude performance meant it often dictated the terms of the engagement, pouncing from above and zooming back up to safety. Despite these tactical lessons, the general Japanese perception remained that the P-47 was an inherently inferior design compared to the sleek, Rapid Zero or the later Kyo-84. This attitude was largely formed by engagements over shorter ranges where the P-47 was often forced to jettison its speed and altitude advantage for lower altitude combat. The lack of extreme range in the earlier P-47 models also confined them to supporting roles closer to Allied bases, limiting their impact on deep Japanese defenses. Japanese intelligence largely overlooked the potential for development within the Thunderbolt design, viewing its characteristics as fixed and immutable. This critical misjudgment would prove a massive strategic error as the war moved into its final, most brutal phases over the Japanese home islands. Their confidence in their own superior turning circle would soon be tested by a new, evolved version of the so-called Iron Pig. As the war in the Pacific shifted towards the Japanese mainland, a crippling strategic challenge emerged for the U.S. Army Air Forces. The new Boeing B-29 Superfortress heavy bomber was designed for very long-range missions, capable of striking targets across vast, unforgiving distances. The primary target was the industrial heartland of Japan, specifically the cities of Nagoya, Osaka, and most crucially, Tokyo itself. These targets lay thousands of miles from the nearest secure American bases, such as those on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the Mariana Islands. The flight to Tokyo and back constituted one of the longest and most dangerous combat missions of the entire war, demanding extreme endurance from the aircraft. B-29s, flying alone or in massive, unescorted formations, were vulnerable for hours on end to Japanese interceptors and heavy anti-aircraft fire. High-altitude winds and the sheer duration of the flight also compounded the fatigue on the flight crews, reducing their ability to maintain defensive vigilance. The existing American fighter aircraft, including the standard P-47D and early P-51 Mustangs, simply did not possess the necessary range to accompany the B-29s all the way. Fighters could only provide protection for a fraction of the outbound journey before being forced to turn back due to rapidly depleting fuel reserves. This left the multi-million-dollar B-29s completely exposed at the most critical point of the mission, over the densely defended target area. Japanese pilots, no longer having to worry about high-performance escort fighters, could launch unhurried, devastating attacks on the vulnerable bomber formations. The lack of effective, continuous fighter escort led to high B-29 loss rates and significantly decreased the psychological impact of the bombing raids. The pilots flying the B-29s desperately required a dependable, tough, and fast fighter that could remain with them from takeoff to the target and back again. This critical operational requirement drove the urgent push for a new, ultra-long-range American fighter capable of overcoming the tyranny of the Pacific's endless ocean. The strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands was the centerpiece of the U.S. war effort in the Pacific in 1944 and 1945. It was theorized that continuous, massive bombardment could force Japan's capitulation before a costly ground invasion was necessary. The capture of the Mariana Islands provided the necessary forward bases, but the 1,500-mile distance to Tokyo remained a profound logistical and combat problem. B-29 formation suffered heavily from Japanese air defense when they crossed the critical point of no return for their escorts. The psychological boost provided by a fighter presence was just as important as the physical defense they offered to the bomber crews. The Americans needed a fighter that could carry significant fuel without sacrificing the speed and altitude performance necessary for combat. The P-51 Mustang was being adapted for long-range missions, but it was already a delicately balanced aircraft, and its liquid-cooled engine was less tolerant of battle damage. The P-47, with its air-cooled radial engine, possessed a legendary resistance to enemy fire, making it the perfect candidate for the grueling over-ocean missions. Engineers at Republic Aviation understood that the P-47's massive airframe also offered unused space for additional fuel capacity within the wings. This potential was the key to unlocking the true long-range potential of the Thunderbolt, transforming it from a continental fighter into a Pacific weapon. The decision was made to radically redesign the P-47 airframe, specifically focusing on the most critical element for endurance, the wings. This major modification would be the final, ultimate evolution of the P-47 line, tailor-made for the punishing requirements of the Marianas to Tokyo route. The resulting aircraft needed to combine the Thunderbolt's signature ruggedness and hitting power with range previously only seen in heavy bombers. The necessity of protecting the B-29 fleet directly drove the development of the ultimate version of the P-47, a decision born from the urgency of a desperate, final campaign. The fate of the entire bombing strategy, and perhaps the course of the war itself, rested on the success of this ambitious new fighter design. The answer to the B-29's vulnerability was the Republic P-47N Thunderbolt, the definitive long-range variant of the formidable fighter. Designers at Republic knew that simply bolting on more drop tanks was an insufficient and aerodynamically inefficient solution for the required range. They instead focused on integrating the necessary fuel capacity directly into the very structure of the aircraft. The P-47N featured completely redesigned, enlarged wings with squared-off tips, increasing the wing area and providing significant new internal volume. This new wing structure was engineered to house two massive internal fuel tanks, one in each wing panel, dramatically increasing the internal fuel load. The new fuel tanks alone added hundreds of gallons of gasoline, pushing the Thunderbolt's unrefueled range to previously unthinkable distances. The end model was also fitted with underwing racks capable of carrying three massive 300-gallon external drop tanks, a truly impressive total fuel load. This combination gave the P-47N an operational range exceeding 2,300 miles, finally enabling it to fly the entire distance from the Marianas to Tokyo and back. To cope with the immense weight of this fuel and the heavier overall airframe, the P-47N was also equipped with an improved R2800-57 engine with a water methanol injection system. This power boost was essential for takeoff performance when fully loaded and for maintaining a competitive combat speed once the plane was stripped of its external tanks. The landing gear was strengthened and slightly repositioned to handle the increased gross weight upon landing after a long, successful mission. Every single modification was a direct response to the specific, brutal requirements of the Pacific long-range escort role. The design team had successfully transformed the Thunderbolt from a durable medium-range fighter bomber into a globe-spanning escort machine. The P-47N retained all the virtues of the earlier models, including the heavy armament of 8.50 caliber guns and the superb battle damage tolerance. It was the ultimate evolution of the Chjug, a purpose-built weapon to address the Pacific's unique strategic distances and bring the fight to the enemy's doorstep. The P-47N's arrival in the Pacific theater marked a monumental shift in the B-29 bombing campaign's security and efficiency. The fighters began arriving at bases on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, islands that had been brutally secured specifically to serve as forward staging points for these long-range missions. With a fully fueled P-47N now at their wingtip, B-29 crews no longer faced the terrifying prospect of a 4-hour combat flight completely alone over the target. The presence of the Thunderbolts provided an immediate, overwhelming psychological lift to the bomber crews, knowing help was constantly near. The massive formation of P-47Ns flying alongside the superfortresses was an incredibly impressive sight, a symbol of American air power dominance. Each Thunderbolt carried the firepower equivalent to a small gunboat, ready to unleash a blizzard of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds upon any aggressor. The pilots of the P-47N squadrons quickly adapted to the new demands of ultra-long-range flight, learning to conserve fuel with disciplined throttle management. They had to maintain radio silence and adhere to the strict formation discipline necessary to successfully shepherd the massive bomber stream across the vast ocean. Upon reaching the Japanese coast, the P-47N pilots would jettison their now empty external drop tanks, instantly transforming their heavily burdened escort plane into a potent fighter. The P-47N proved to be an excellent high-altitude performer, capable of easily mixing it up with any of the late-war Japanese interceptors. Its speed in a dive and its powerful engine meant it remained the master of hit-and-run tactics, refusing to be drawn into the slower, turning fights preferred by the Japanese. The aircraft's legendary ruggedness made it a perfect fit for the high-risk environment of flak and concentrated enemy fire over the Japanese home islands. The ultimate escort had finally arrived, a heavy, resilient, and long-legged fighter capable of matching the B-29's reach and protecting its invaluable crews. The deployment of the P-47N was inextricably linked to the ferocious island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific. The success of the long-range escort missions depended entirely on securing and constructing forward operating bases closer to Japan. The capture of Iwo Jima in February 1945, after one of the costliest battles in Marine Corps history, was a pivotal strategic victory for this purpose. Its small, volcanic airfields, once secured, were rapidly expanded and reinforced by the tireless efforts of U.S. Navy Seabees. These newly built runways became the critical intermediate refueling and emergency landing strips for the B-29s, and later, the home base for the P-47N. The distance from the Marianas to Tokyo was still too great for the P-47N to fly a full combat mission without an intermediate base. However, stationing the Thunderbolts on Iwo Jima dramatically cut the required escort distance, making a full mission-length escort possible. Okinawa, captured in the spring of 1945, provided an even closer and more strategic base for the P-47N and other American fighters. The sight of the powerful Thunderbolts parked on the captured ground was a tangible symbol of the relentless advance of the Allied forces. These new island bases also provided a forward repair and maintenance depot, essential for keeping the high-utilization P-47NS operational. The logistics involved in supplying and operating an entire fleet of fighter squadrons from these remote, newly acquired islands were staggering. Every barrel of aviation fuel, every spare part, and every round of ammunition had to be shipped thousands of miles across the ocean. The air bases themselves became targets of desperate, final Japanese counterattacks, requiring the P-47NS to also fly defensive combat air patrols. The P-47N was thus not just a long-range fighter but also the guardian of the small, precarious forward bases that enabled the entire strategic bombing campaign. The most anticipated and challenging mission for the P-47N was the full-distance escort to the heart of the Japanese Empire, Tokyo. The very idea of a single-engine fighter flying a round trip of thousands of miles, including high-G combat, was a feat of unprecedented aviation engineering. The mission began well before dawn, with pilots strapping into their cockpits in the cold pre-daylight hours, the air thick with the smell of high-octane gasoline. The initial takeoff, with the P-47N at its maximum possible weight due to the massive fuel load, was always a tense, heavy event for the pilots. The Thunderbolts would slowly climb to altitude, forming up with the B-29 stream in a massive, coordinated air armada high above the Pacific clouds. For hours, the flight was a marathon of careful instrument flying and fuel management, demanding extreme concentration from every pilot. The pilots had to constantly monitor their engine settings, maintaining the most efficient mixture for the long cruise without overheating the powerful radial engine. As the coast of Japan finally appeared on the horizon, the sheer scale of the mission and the impending threat of combat would snap the entire formation to full attention. The sight of the rugged coastline was confirmation that the Iron Pig had finally made the journey that had been deemed impossible by many. The escorts would weave and bob around the B-29s, providing a constant, moving wall of high explosive defense as the bombers entered the defense zone. Japanese interceptors, expecting a vulnerable, unescorted stream of bombers, were instead met with a determined, resilient fighter screen. The P-47N had officially conquered the vast distances of the Pacific, closing the lethal gap that had previously existed over the target. It had finally reached the enemy's seat of power, directly challenging the Japanese confidence that their home islands were strategically unreachable by short-range fighters. The first major engagements with P-47Ns over the Japanese home islands were a brutal, shocking awakening for the Japanese fighter defense forces. Japanese pilots were accustomed to attacking unescorted B-29s or dealing with short-legged P-51s that were dangerously low on fuel reserves. The sight of the P-47, which they had previously mocked as a clumsy giant, suddenly appearing over Tokyo at combat weight was a profound strategic surprise. The P-47N pilots, having shed their external tanks, were now free to engage, utilizing the Thunderbolts' strengths of speed, diving power, and superior high-altitude performance. The Japanese pilots quickly discovered that the Fatso was anything but slow when it counted, especially when capitalizing on its mass in a high-energy maneuver. The terrifying sound of 8.50 caliber machine guns opening fire in unison delivered a dense, unforgiving stream of lead into the air. This immense hitting power, delivering nearly 100 rounds per second, often caused Japanese aircraft to simply disintegrate in mid-air. The P-47N became a heavy counterpunch to the Japanese doctrine of light, nimble interceptors, which lacked the armor to survive a single pass. The engagements were often short and violent, with the Thunderbolts diving through formations of Japanese fighters, making passes, and then using their speed to climb away. The presence of the P-47N forced the Japanese air defense to change its entire strategy, having to contend with a truly capable, long-range escort. This increased threat made the interception of the B-29 significantly more difficult and costly for the Imperial Air Forces. The P-47N effectively shut down the unmolested attacks on the bomber formations, forcing the Japanese to respect the power and reach of the American fighters. The era of Japanese mockery was over, replaced by a grim realization that a heavy, durable American fighter was now dictating the air war above the home islands. The P-47's most enduring and valuable trait, its incredible resilience, was never more important than on the long flight back from Tokyo. After hours of flying and a brutal combat engagement, the aircraft often returned to base riddled with bullet holes and damaged by flak. The massive, air-cooled radial engine was famously robust, capable of running with cylinders shot out and still maintaining enough power to fly. Pilots often spoke of their jugged taking hits that would have forced any other fighter type to ditch in the unforgiving waters of the Pacific. The Thunderbolt's extensive internal armor protection around the pilot and vital systems earned the lasting trust of the men who flew it. Many accounts from the Pacific detail P-47Ns returning to Iwo Jima with pieces of the wing structure missing or controls partially severed. The structural integrity of the heavy airframe allowed the pilots to nurse their damaged birds across the enormous stretches of ocean back to the relative safety of the forward bases. This characteristic was absolutely essential for the P-47NS mission, as a disabled aircraft over the Pacific often meant a fatal ditching and the loss of the pilot. The sheer mass of the Thunderbolt, initially a cause for enemy scorn, was actually its greatest strength in the unforgiving theater of war. It was a machine built to take a hit, shake it off, and continue the mission, a testament to Republic Aviation's philosophy of survival. The P-47N's ability to consistently bring its pilots home, even when grievously wounded, provided an additional layer of confidence and morale to the entire escort operation. This legendary durability ensured that the long-range missions could continue day after day, despite the fierce and determined resistance from the Japanese defenses. The pilots affectionately knew that their iron pig would absorb a beating and continue to fly, fulfilling its duty as the unsinkable escort for the B-29s. The arrival of the P-47N over Tokyo completely shattered the assumptions of Japanese military planners and the confidence of their pilots. For months, their strategy had relied on the safe perimeter created by the B-29's lack of close-in, long-range fighter protection. Japanese intelligence was slow to report and even slower to believe the existence of an American fighter with such a drastic increase in combat range. The initial reports of American single-engine fighters engaging over the home islands were often dismissed as sightings of older, short-range aircraft operating from hidden, nearby carriers. When the reality of the P-47N's continuous presence became undeniable, it forced a frantic and disruptive reassessment of their entire air defense strategy. The Japanese pilots, who had trained to hunt down slow-moving, defenseless bombers, were now faced with the task of tangling with a powerful, specialized American escort fighter. They were forced to commit their remaining high-performance interceptors, such as the Kawanishi N-1K J Shidenkai, to the fighter-versus-fighter battles high above the cities. This shift in focus diverted crucial defensive resources away from the direct interception of the B-29 formations themselves, significantly easing the bomber crew's burden. The sudden, long-term threat of the P-47N also degraded the psychological edge held by the Japanese pilots, who now knew they faced a capable enemy over their own territory. The feeling of a safe, impenetrable home airspace was permanently lost to the Japanese military high command. The very fighter they had laughed at months earlier had now become one of the most effective and persistent threats to their final defense of the empire. The P-47N had not merely closed a gap in the mission profile, it had turned the tables on the Japanese air defense, rendering their earlier mockery utterly meaningless. The P-47N represents the pinnacle of piston-engine fighter development during the Second World War, a final, specialized triumph of engineering. It was the ultimate expression of the Thunderbolt's rugged design philosophy, prioritizing strength and firepower above all else. The story of the end model's successful mission to Tokyo is a powerful testament to the relentless American industrial capacity and design adaptability. It proved that a fighter, even one as massive as the P-47, could be fundamentally re-engineered to meet the seemingly impossible demands of the war's geography. The pilots of the P-47N squadrons often considered their aircraft to be the single most reliable piece of equipment in the terrifying environment of the Pacific Air War. They flew the longest and most strategically critical escort missions of the entire conflict, often flying for over 8 grueling hours at a time. The success of the P-47N in protecting the B-29 formations directly contributed to the devastating effectiveness of the final bombing campaign against Japan. The fighter's ability to survive catastrophic damage and fly home across the vast, empty ocean cemented its place in aviation history as the unsinkable escort. The mockery from Japanese pilots was silenced by the physical reality of the P-47N's presence and its heavy cannons over their capital city. The legacy of the P-47N is one of perseverance, a heavy-duty fighter that overcame initial limitations and the scorn of its enemies to become an indispensable weapon of war. Its final variant proved that the heavy Iron Pig could indeed dance with the best of them, and do so across an entire ocean, reaching the enemy's final doorstep.